Hi, welcome back to Humanistic Psychology here at the University of West Georgia. This video is the fourth video in a series that explores Abraham Maslow's The Farther Reaches of Human Nature. Where we were at the end of the last video is we just got done talking about Chapter 2, which has to do with the Jonah complex, and we're about to embark on Chapter 3. So, the title of Chapter 3 is Self-actualizing and Beyond, and already there's a kind of riddle woven into the title of Chapter 3, because, well, if all of our motivations ultimately point toward actualizing the deepest possibilities of our being, then the question is, what could possibly lie beyond that? It seems like at first that would be sort of the utter apex or the utter peak of what it is to exist as a human being. If we're more or less spending a fair fraction of our time glimpsing and then making real the deepest possibilities that are inherent to our own unique individual human constitution, then it's hard to imagine what could possibly lie beyond that. So, self-actualizing and beyond. So what might lie beyond, in a sense, self-actualizing? Well, the answer to that riddle goes something like this, that it turns out that the self of self-actualization actually involves a kind of selflessness. So there's a little bit of a paradox or a tension in the very phrase self-actualization. So when we self-actualize, what we're actually starting to do is become less selfish or less self-centered. So, and for some people, well, actually, for some people, they don't really understand that about self-actualization. Some people have the idea that self-actualization is really ultimately about becoming more self-centered and more self-obsessed and more selfish ultimately. But Maslow makes it pretty clear that the exact opposite is actually the case. For instance, on page 42 of your book, he writes, self-actualizing people are, without a single exception, involved in a cause outside their own skin. So being implosively self-involved and self-centered is not a marker of self-actualization. In fact, it's the very opposite of that. So to illustrate that in your notes, I thought I'd invite you to wonder about a distinction between what a calling is in life and what a job is in life. And since most of you watching are my students and you're young people, you're probably used to having jobs of various sorts. And by the way, I did too. Most of us have to go through that period where we're doing things that aren't all that pleasant. We're not necessarily getting a lot of money for them, but we have to do them in order to make practical ends meet. So, if you have a job and you find that you have a job simply to try to fill in the missing pieces, most obviously money, in your life, well, there's no shame in that. In fact, most of us have to go through that. But that doesn't necessarily in itself mean that having a job is your ultimate destination in this life. Maybe there's something beyond having a job that just helps to get you through the pragmatic demands of life. Maybe there's something to a calling or a vocation in the etymological sense. Vocation, we get that word from vocare in Latin, which is a verb that means to call. So the question is, what is the difference between a calling and a job? Well, the first thing we can say with respect to this issue of the selflessness of self-actualization is having a job is about us. It's about meeting our needs. But having a calling is about the calling. You getting it? Like having a calling is about something larger than our own immediate needs, right? So having a calling means something much greater than our own little world. Okay, so a calling, another way of thinking about it, a calling is about intrinsic rewards. In other words, you have a calling for the value inherent to the calling itself. The calling is its own meaning, its own rationale, whereas a job is about doing something to get something else. So you have a job, let's say you work in a restaurant, in order to get money. So maybe you're waiting tables or something like that, or washing dishes. I had to wash dishes back in the day. So why would I do such a thing? Well, I'm not such an evolved soul that I would find washing dishes to be intrinsically rewarding. You know, perhaps there are souls that are that evolved, but I'm not one of them. So I wash dishes in order to get paid. So a job is about extrinsic rewards. Extrinsic means that the value comes from something external. The most obvious kind of extrinsic reward would be money, but there are other kinds too, like status would be an extrinsic reward, like how other people perceive you. That's what status is about. You know, position, hierarchical position would be an extrinsic reward. But a calling is about intrinsic rewards. You can apply this same sort of logic to being a student, by the way. You know, so if your main motivation for being a student is to get a better job with higher pay, and by the way, everyone wants a better job with higher pay. So if that's your primary motivation, there's no shame in that. But if your primary motivation is that, then it's more on the extrinsic side of things. If you're a student primarily because you love the process of learning and thinking and developing within the academic intellectual project, then that's more of an intrinsic reward. Okay, so a calling is more about B values. So let's remember what a B value is from, I guess, video number 1 in this series. So a B value is the kind of value that would attend the fulfillment of the deepest recesses of your being, whereas a job is more about D values. So what's a D value about? Well, it's a deficiency value, which means you're just trying to get something that you don't have, most obviously money. Okay, so a calling is about working for the work, whereas a job is about working for the weekend. And here, there was a kind of dinosaur band when I was growing up, and the name of the dinosaur band was Loverboy, and they had a big hit song called Working for the Weekend. And if I may be permitted to quote from that song, the lyrics went something like this: everybody's working for the weekend. And it was a really happy, upbeat type of song, and I think sort of what the mood they were going for, it's like, yeah, all right, everyone's working for the weekend. But if you think about that, if you're working for the weekend, in other words, the weekend is the only time of your life when you really get to sort of live your life. If you're living basically someone else's life 5 days out of 7 and your life only 2 days out of 7, well, 2 days out of 7 is 28.56% of your life that you get. But if you think about it, you don't really get that full 28.56%, because part of your weekend, if you're working for the weekend, has to do with the fact that you're probably too damn tired from your work week to enjoy the full 28.56%. So you're probably really whittled down to 20% just because you have to sleep in Saturday and that sort of thing just to recover from your hard work weekend. But actually, if you think about it, you don't really get that 20% either, because if you're working for the weekend, well, the thing is, you know, you're probably busy during the regular week, and so you probably have a lot of chores to do on the weekend. You have to wash your clothes and mow the lawn and maybe work on your car or clean the gutters or something like that. So in order to get through those chores, well, that whittles down that 20% even further. So maybe you're at, I don't know, 14% of your life is left on the weekend for you to enjoy if you're working for the weekend. But actually, when you think about it, you don't get that 14% either, because if you're really working for the weekend, then probably you're going to spend part of Sunday dreading the start of the next work week. That's not quality time for you to live your life. So really, that 14% is whittled down to, I don't know, 7 or 8%. Let's say 7%. So, okay, if you're working for the weekend, you really get 7% of your life, and 93% of your life is spent on something else, let's put it that way. So 7% of your life, I don't know, does that seem like a reasonable fraction to you? Because I don't know, I'm a little bit older than you. Odds are I'm about 3 times older than you, and that doesn't seem like a reasonable fraction to me. But you know, maybe I've grown more unreasonable as I've gotten older. So the reason why I'm giving you this brief exercise in what I like to think of as terroristic arithmetic is that I'm trying to bring into sharp relief a question that's already in the air as you are moving through your college years. The question is, are you moving more toward a job governed by D needs and extrinsic rewards, which, by the way, have their time and place in life, no one's denying that? Or on the other hand, is the main movement, the main thing you're going through, heading you more toward a calling in some deep sense of the word, where things begin to take on their own reasons, quite apart from external factors, that the value inheres in the activity of what you're doing yourself. So since most of you are psychology majors, the activity would inhere in the very value of doing psychology in one way or another, let's say clinically, helping other people with their difficulties and problems and psychological suffering. Now, if you're able to enter into more of a calling, you might lay claim to more than 7% of your life, like that paradigm wherein you end up with basically about 7% of your life might not work for you anymore. Like maybe you'll be, I don't know, let's say you're having, as a professor, let me sort of say it as a professor, I'll say it personally. As a professor, I like to be having a good time about 75% of the time or more. I've grown that unreasonable as I've gotten older. Like I like to be having like a good time, and by a good time I also mean a fulfilling time where it feels like I'm in some way starting to fulfill the deeper possibilities of my being about 75% of the time. I'm not a purist or an idealist. I don't believe that you can end up with 100% of your life. I think that sometimes you just got to pay the piper. Okay, I've made my peace with that. I'm willing to pay the piper 25% of my life, but not much more than that. Hey, but that's just me. Your answer may be different. Okay, so once again, what's the main point? That was a little bit of a digression again, I guess. But so what's the main point? The main point is that, of course, self-actualization involves a kind of selflessness, and doing a job is about your needs. Being involved in a calling is about something much greater than your needs. Being involved in self-actualization is about opening yourself to the larger horizon of things. It's not just about you and your world. It's about opening yourself to the wide plenum of the universe, opening the wings of your soul so that you can catch the wild wind of reality itself. Just a thought, in case you need a new hobby. Okay, so track along with your notes a little bit. So basically what this boils down to is that the humanistic ideal of self-actualization isn't so much about individuality in the sense of being self-absorbed, self-centered, disconnected, insular, isolated, all of that kind of stuff. It's not about that. It's about, yes, being yourself. That's true. But being yourself exactly in relation to the world. This should not surprise you at this point in the semester. The reason why is because we've characterized humanistic psychology over and over in terms of holism. Well, if that's true, if holism is the central animating principle of humanistic psychology, well, guess what? Holism includes the holistic totality of all things, that you're always living in relation to larger totalities than your own little world. That's integral to any kind of holistic approach, whether it's humanistic psychology or not. So this should not be a shock to you. It's only a shock to people who have, I think, a cartoonish caricature view of humanistic psychology as a mode of psychology that encourages a kind of implosive, insular, disconnected self-absorption. And that rumor is out there in the world. That's why I feel like I have to talk about it at some length, because there's this sort of rumor about humanistic psychology that's out there, and I don't know where people are getting that, because in the text that I read, I'm not seeing it. In fact, I'm seeing the exact opposite. The point of pursuing this path within psychology is ultimately to open ourselves more to what life is, to seek out greater levels of connection and interconnection with each other, as well as being ourselves as we do it. But hey, that's just me. You can tell I'm getting a little excited about that, because I think it's a real bad way of characterizing what humanistic psychology actually is. Okay, so what is the vision of individuality? Kind of like I just said, it's in being a person, being an individual in the sense of, yes, being oneself, but also engaged in participating actively and vitally in the world, which of course includes the world of other people. Sociality is there at the ground level. Can we say that and have that be okay? All right. Okay, so the next, actually this chapter 3, is broken into 3 parts. So that's sort of the first introductory part. So I guess the bulk of this video will be about the next section, and probably we'll have to leave the last section to the next video. So the next section is a list Oddly enough, these humanistic psychologists, despite their emphasis on qualitative approaches to psychology, love numerically oriented lists. And that may be their Jungian shadow side. Who knows? You know, they might have to individuate a bit and incorporate that in. So here's a list of, quote, behaviors leading to self-actualization. And the way I would like you to learn this is not to go memorizing the elements on this list. I would like you to experience the next few minutes of this video as each element of this list is a kind of brushstroke that's beginning to paint a picture of what self-actualization looks like. That's the important thing, that you gain some kind of understanding or some kind of view of what self-actualization actually starts to look like. So that's the point of this next little list, and I'll go through them item by item to help paint that picture for you. So on page 43, we're on page 43, experiencing fully, vividly, selflessly, there's that word again, with full concentration and total absorption. Like having moments in your life where you are really in the moment of your life and not doing what we typically do, which is to have half our mind deflected somewhere else, like what we want to do after this, or sort of ruminating about memories from the past, or this, that, the other thing, or seeking some sort of distraction somehow. But Maslow, according to Maslow, one of the behaviors leading to self-actualization is learning to inhabit the moments of your life fully, with full presence, and not seeking out some mode of distraction or something like that. In fact, being so fully in the moment that your normal sense of self begins to dissolve a little bit. Okay, so not self-consciously. Okay, so that's a negative way of saying it. And I sort of updated his language a little bit. I said, you know, the experience of being in the zone with something. And the thing is that that phrase came from athletics, like basketball and stuff. They would say like, well, so-and-so is in the zone. What does that mean? That means that that person is so much in the moment that everything that he or she does is going to be the right thing. So an athlete is so in the moment, let's say in basketball, that every shot is going to drop, you know, like that sort of thing. That's what it is to be in the zone. Now, the thing about being in the zone is that you can be in the zone with respect to anything you're doing in your life, okay? So you don't have to be an athlete. So, like, if you can't relate to that example, like, think about what it is you do in your life. Like, you can be in the zone in video games. You can be in the zone with respect to your studies and studying for the next test, or taking the next test for that matter. Like, you're so in the moment and your talents are so unblocked and pouring through you so directly because you're really present to the moment that everything that you do is going to be the fullness of what you can possibly do. Okay, so that's the first one. And that's a pretty tall order for most of us to have moments, and, you know, to value moments, and to hope to have more of them, and to make a practice, hopefully, of having moments like that. Once again, it doesn't have to be something grandiose. It could be like you could be in the zone making a meal. You could be in the zone brushing your teeth in some way. So I'd like to sort of bring it down to the ground, the low ground level a little bit, because sometimes you talk about this stuff and it seems like, well, you know, just people who are in the upper echelons of pro basketball or something like that. It applies to them and no one else. No, that's not true. No matter what you're doing, you could be in the zone listening to me right now, for that matter. You know, like absorbing stuff from this video. Okay, number 2. He says, self-actualization is an ongoing process that arises out of ongoing choices in life. Okay, so the first thing to notice is that your choices and your exercise of freedom are important to your self-actualization. Okay, so your choices, your decisions are important to this. Now, a quote from the book: to make the growth choice rather than the fear choice. Okay, now, sometimes in life, and maybe you're old enough to have detected this, sometimes in life will put you at a crossroads where you have possibly multiple, let's say 2 to make it simple, 2 different paths you can go down in your life. Like, you can either turn right or you can turn left. And at some level you know that, well, turning right, let's say, is really about you're trying to be safe and secure and do the easy thing and just get through. And there's a time and a place for that. Okay, once again, let's not put that down. Sometimes it's important to make the fear choice, because fear is an adaptive relation to life. Let's not forget that. But sometimes it's important to make the difficult growth choice. Okay? Sometimes when you're presented with a pair of choices like that, life is actually asking you not to stay safe, but to pick the thing that maybe feels a little bit dangerous, because it might carry you over the edge of what you're used to in some way. It might sort of push you to the outer limits of what you know and what's habitual in your life. And the thing about the outer limits is, for the most part, that's where we grow as human beings. We rarely grow when we're just sort of sitting comfortably in our lounge chairs, and I guess I can sort of do this. We're just sort of, we put our feet up on the ottoman and pour ourselves a fine cognac in a snifter and possibly, light up like a mentholated Tiparillo. And we're really comfortable, and it's warm and fuzzy, and maybe there's a fire crackling right next to us and all of that kind of stuff. Yeah, okay, good enough sometimes. Yeah, time and a place for it. But sometimes life is actually asking for the exact opposite. Sometimes life is asking us to make the difficult choice. The philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche once said, "Build your cities on the slopes of Vesuvius. Sail your ships into uncharted seas." So sometimes life is actually asking you to dwell at the outer limits of who and what you are, because for the most part, that's where we grow. That's where we transform. That's where we're challenged to become something more than ourselves. We don't, for the most part, grow when we're sitting by the fire and sipping cognac and all of that kind of stuff. Assuming you're 21, of course. Don't want to be sued. All right, so to make the growth choice rather than the fear choice, and this is, by the way, this takes a little bit of practice for most people to learn to start to make the growth choice, or even to realize that every now and then in your life there's a fear path, a fear-driven path, and a growth-driven path, a challenge-driven path. Even to be able to recognize that that's happening takes some practice, and it takes even more practice to learn to make the growth choice every now and then. So number 3, to listen to what our own inner voice tells us, to learn to pay attention to it. That's sort of related to number 2 if you think about it, because your inner voice probably is at points the thing that's telling you that here's the fear path, here's the path that you would go if you want to stay safe and not really challenge yourself too much. But here's the difficult path that'll take you to your outer limits, where you can transform your life and your being. And who knows what you'll become when you do that? Who knows? Maybe something really beautiful. So to listen to what our own inner voice tells us. To thine own self be true, as Shakespeare wrote in Hamlet. This above all things, to thine own self be true. It's an easy thing to say, a little bit harder to do. Rather than just doing what we typically do. Well, what do we typically do? Well, we typically do one of two things. We look around and see what other people are doing and just conform to whatever that is, and or we just obey orders, like someone in authority tells us what to do, and then we do it. So that's what we typically do. We do what they think is good. Like they say you should lose weight, they say you should quit smoking. You ever wonder about who that they is that says that? Because most of the time you can't really put a name or a face to who's saying that. And I think the insight into who the they is, the best insight comes to us by way of the philosopher Martin Heidegger, who said that, well, it's really the anonymous way that things get propagated across the social terrain. The reason why there's not commonly a face and a name you can associate with what they tell you to do is because there is no name and face most of the time. Every now and then you can pin it on someone, but most of the time you can't. So it's learning to drop the habit of doing what they say you should do all the time as though you're some kind of robot or puppet, and instead learn to start to pay attention to what your soul is telling you, okay? To what your own inner voice is telling you, because that may be a more reliable compass at certain points, certain critical points in your life, than what they say to do, okay? All right, number 4 is related, I think, to number 3. To be honest with ourselves, to take responsibility for our choices. Oh my goodness, what an easy thing to say that's way harder to do. To take responsibility for the quality of our lives, for our abilities, our attitudes, our situation. Take responsibility for the people that we are, the human beings, who, and inevitably, every single one of us has a certain range of strengths and talents and a certain range of deficits and weaknesses. But to take responsibility for all of that, hypothetical question. Suppose the main variable in the equation that determines the quality of your life actually is your choices and your ability to be responsible for your choices. Just a weird thought. Not that there aren't other variables. There certainly are: genetic dispositions and your placement within sort of the social hierarchy and power hierarchies and all kinds of stuff like that. It's a complicated equation that determines the quality of our lives. But suppose, just suppose, as a thought experiment, that the main variable in that equation, the most important variable in that equation, was your ongoing choice of your path in life and your capacity to take responsibility for the quality of your life as you live it. Suppose that were the main variable. Just a thought. Okay, number 5. Okay, developing a sense for destiny, for mission. Now this I would more or less connect up with that business of having a calling rather than a job that we were talking about before. So developing a sense for something much larger than your own concerns and your own pleasures and your own well-being and all of that kind of stuff. So according to Maslow, people who are moving towards self-actualization usually, or perhaps always, have a sense for something much larger than themselves, something like a calling, something like a destiny. Suppose you had a range of possibilities that was part and parcel of who and what you are right now, that if you were to live toward that consistently, it would coalesce into something like a destiny. Okay, so I'm using kind of an odd, almost 19th century word. Suppose that there was something like a destiny running through who and what you are, given that you are the person that you are. And in order to actualize that destiny, to make it real, you would have to learn to glimpse it within yourself and then learn to live toward it moment by moment. That's self-actualization, okay? So he says it this way: making an honest statement in your life or with your life involves daring to be different, unpopular, nonconformist. It's not just about obedience. I'm sorry. Being prepared to be unpopular, to deviate. Frank Zappa once said, you know, without deviancy, there is no progress in the world. Right? So without the capacity to deviate from the norms that normally dictate who and what we're supposed to be, without an ability to deviate from that, there's no progress, both at the individual level and at the grand social level too. Remember, those always are interconnected. Okay, so being prepared to be unpopular. To be courageous rather than afraid is another version of the same thing, he writes. Okay, so number 6. Okay, this one we've sort of talked about too. Some of these things get repetitive, and I hope you get a sense for that. That means you're getting a sense for the picture we're trying to paint here in this moment of your life. Being open to the moment. Okay, so earlier on I was talking about learning to inhabit the moments of your life fully. By the way, meditation is a great way of doing that. Like, I can speak from personal experience that learning to meditate really can help with that process if you find that that's a difficult thing for you. If you find in your life that you always are longing for the next distraction, to put it in the words of Alanis Morissette, who was a singer in the 90s. I love that 90s rock music, my goodness, and I love to play it too. So, as a musician, that is. So, if you find yourself sort of ruled by your longings for the next distraction, if you find yourself always needing to be entertained all the damn time in one way or another, well, maybe there's a deeper paradigm for your life. Just a weird sort of suggestion, possibly. So being open to the moment, open to the process of actualizing your unique human potentials at any moment in your life. And of all the moments in your life, many of which have occurred in the past, and hopefully, although you don't really know, especially with the coronavirus going around, how many you'll have in the future. The one moment in your life that has a priority with respect to all of this is the moment right now, as you're listening to me, right now. Okay, so interesting. I said the phrase right now, and the camera cut off. I sometimes take synchronicities as life's way of punctuating the sentences of our lives. So I take that as an affirmation. When I say right now and the camera cuts off, maybe that's a way of punctuating the right nowness of things. So here's a quote from Maslow about this. It does not mean doing some far out thing necessarily, a little bit of antiquated 60s language there. So it doesn't mean sort of going out and like sometimes people think, well, self-actualization, they hear about it, like I better get over to Nepal and book a flight to Kathmandu so that I can go up into the Himalayas and find a guru and sit in meditation for 16 hours a day because I really want to be self-actualizing. Well, the point here is that is not necessarily your path, okay? Maybe it is, maybe it isn't. You don't have to be sort of going out of your way to do anything spectacular to self-actualize. Self-actualization means working to do well the thing that one really wants to do with your life. So you don't need to go to Tibet, you don't need to go to Nepal, you don't need to climb into the Himalayas, like nothing like that. You don't need to buy the special shoes or I guess sandals in this case. You don't need to, buy a saffron robe or anything like that, What you need to do is to tune in to life as you experience it from moment to moment, to take up your tasks that you have to do, let's say as an undergraduate student. See, that's where self-actualization lies, in taking up what you have to do anyhow, but with a completely different attitude and a completely different sensibility and a completely different sense of purpose and meaning behind it. So, like taking tests, studying for tests, listening to videos like this one. That's where your road of self-actualization is. It doesn't mean, going out and finding a guru or whatever you think it might mean. So to illustrate that, I put a little thing from Buddhism in there, a little saying. So before your enlightenment, okay, so in Buddhism there's this ideal of enlightenment, which means passing beyond the cycle of birth and rebirth, let's say. And okay, so before all that happens, what do you do? Well, you do everyday things. You chop wood, you carry water, you study for your tests, you write your papers and so on. Well, after enlightenment, after you become enlightened, like, oh my goodness, such a different world after enlightenment. And in one way, yes, but in another way, no. Well, what's the way no? The way no is that, well, you're doing your everyday tasks just with a different sensibility, a different posture, a different attitude, and ultimately a different experience of life. Okay, so, if you think, well, I got to quit being a student and, become a Dharma bum or something like that, it's like, no, not necessarily. Like the road of your self-actualization might lie exactly along the path of being a student. Okay, so number 7. Peak experiences can't be just willed. Okay, so peak experiences are kind of like the muses of antiquity. The thing about the muses of antiquity, by the way, if you don't know about the muses of antiquity, they were the deities, female deities, a collection of them that governed the creative arts. So the muses of antiquity, you can't just order them around. All right, so if you want to be creative, you can't just sort of give an order to the muse and have her appear, and there'll be this beatific moment, oh, and all of a sudden, you'll be creative. It doesn't work that way. So peak experience is kind of like the same thing. You can't just will it. Your choices are important, your decisions are important, yes, we mentioned that earlier, but you can't just sort of by sheer fiat bring about your peak experiences or your self-actualization. But, on the other hand, we can willfully set up more favorable conditions for them. Okay, so it's like if you want the muse to visit you, it might be a good idea to, let's say, make a great dinner and light some candles and put on some good music and set up favorable conditions so that you can perhaps be creative. And who knows, maybe the muse will be upon you if you do that, or maybe not, because they're capricious. And he suggests that maybe meta counselors can help with this. Okay, so here's the thing about that prefix, meta. Okay, he's not using it in the way that normal English speakers use it. When he puts that meta prefix on something, he's using it as a code word for self-actualization. So meta counselor would be a kind of therapist, I guess, or counselor that would help someone with their self-actualization process. And finally, number 8, last thing, because this video is already plenty long. Movement towards self-actualization, he says, tends to be somewhat painful. Okay, it's not like all about, like rainbows and unicorns and lollipops and stuff like that. It involves identifying our defenses, questioning, most of all, what we're invested in not questioning. The things that really rule us, the things that really imprison us, are the things that we simply take to be reality. Okay? So our way of construing the real is our deepest prison. So, like the things that seem like we could not possibly question are exactly the things that we need to question the most if we want to be on this road towards self-actualization. If you really want to be liberated, if you really want to be brought to the outer edge of your being where you might transform your life, it might involve questioning all your habits, all your present trajectory of your life up to this point, and so on. In other words, all the things that most of us would rather not question. And let's sort of end this video with this last little thing. So that's a painful process. That's a difficult process. No one really wants to do that. For the most part, most of us need to be dragged, kicking and screaming into doing that, digging in our heels as deeply as we can. But he says, what's the alternative, really? Because repressing all of that is not a good way of solving our problems. And I would add, it's not a good way of building the kind of life that we would be truly proud and truly able to revel in at the end of the day. And here, at the end of the day, means at the end of the day of our existence. So to live a truly brilliant, worthwhile life means going where we think we cannot go. Okay, have a nice day.